Good afternoon, everyone. This is the first of our Understanding series. Today we're going to be talking about what is carbon, and hopefully you're going to get a basic understanding so you can take it back to your school and start influencing some of those decisions that are being made around things that affect our carbon footprints, but also look at your own practices within school and out of school as well, to be able to understand the things that you can do, that you can change and are within your control. So I'm going to hand over to Dave from PECT, and he'll be taking you through the presentation. If you do have any questions, then please pop them in the chat and then we'll look at those either throughout the presentation or we'll get to them at the end. So over to you.
Thank you, Heidi. Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to today's session. So, as Heidi just said, we're here to talk about carbon. And this is hopefully just a quick sort of whistle-stop tour into what carbon is, and hopefully help you understand the impact that it's having and why it's vital that we start to address this something to start working towards reducing. So just introduce myself. So my name is David Knight. I am the Senior Energy Consultant at PECT and at the Investors Environment as well. My role essentially is to help organizations and businesses across the UK to understand the resources that they're using, how that constitutes in terms of their carbon footprints, and then put together methods and activities they can do to reduce those. So I'm here today on the invitation of Heidi to hopefully help yourselves understand a bit more and hopefully put together some actions as well. Just in terms of what we're going to cover today, so these slides should be made available for anybody who wants them. There's some useful links and stuff within them that I think would be really good to sort of to go through, to be aware of, just where you can get more information from. We're obviously going to address what carbon is. We're going to go through the concepts of why it's important and how it sort of impacts the environment. We're going to talk a bit about the carbon cycle to understand actually how carbon interacts with the atmosphere and how it actually interacts with the planet. We're going to talk about carbon footprint, what that is, how you would calculate a carbon footprint, or what a carbon footprint can be made up of. We're also then going to talk through things like what sort of actions are available to you. What are some of the simple things that you can start to do now and hopefully develop on with time as well. And then just very quickly towards the end, we're just going to talk about different carbon terms that you may have heard, spoken about across the news, maybe colleagues across industry, anything. So just terms that we've probably heard banded around, but what do they actually mean? And when we see someone say, well, what is net zero? You'll be able to hopefully answer the question from the back of that as well. So kicking off then. So just what I always like to do is I always like to provide some useful links. Now, these are really useful if you want to research more on the topics, and some great sources to go to. You can see on there, NASA actually comes up quite a lot. But in terms of what they've done, so NASA has done a lot of work around understanding climate. They've done a lot of work around, measuring carbon footprints, measuring carbon in the atmosphere, measuring planetary temperatures. So it's a great place to go to if you want to understand more about what carbon is and how it's actually impacting the planet. The top link on there is fantastic. It has a timeline from, I think, back until the 1970s, and actually shows you the changes through a sort of a video, and actually shows you how carbon has changed and also how the temperature has changed as well, in a really, really well put together sort of video as well. For any teachers who'd like to, perhaps maybe engage with kids to make the science a little bit simpler, the NASA Climate Kids is a great sort of area that actually explains it really simply. So, if you want to bring any of this into your class, that's a great place to go to find some good sources and some good explanations to perhaps some questions you might want to talk about. And then the Show Your Stripes. So the image we have here, so this Show Your Stripes is basically a fantastic, again, visual imagery that demonstrates the planet warming and how we are putting into that, and how climate change is actually being affected by our activity. So, a great visual to use. And the best thing about it, it's really simple to understand as well. So on to today's topic then. So what is carbon? So the term carbon is essentially used to categorize and describe the impact we have on climate change. And carbon is essentially a collection made up of 7 gases. So in 1997, under the Kyoto Protocol, so this is a sort of a gathering of bodies that determined that there were 7 recognized greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are causing climate change, or at the time, global warming. So these seven recognized gases are essentially deliver most of the activity that we produce, and each of these gases have a different impact in terms of both their warming effects, but also how long they last in the atmosphere. So what they did is they looked at all the 7 gases that we essentially put out through our activities, but to make it simpler, they actually collected them all and worked out what the carbon equivalent is. So rather than having to calculate 7 different processes, they looked at how much of the impact does it have over a 100-year period, what it would be if you were to compare it exactly to carbon dioxide, and then they provided the values. So when we talk about carbon, we're not specifically talking about carbon dioxide, although that is the most prevalent one. We actually talk about carbon as all of the impact we have across the different gases as well. So it's really important to note that carbon stays in the atmosphere for around about 100 years. So any changes that we make now will still take about 100 years before the full effects are made. This is one of the reasons why scientists are so keen to start to take action now, because we can't really wait, because every year we wait, that's another year gone by when it's going to take 100 years for the carbon that's already in the atmosphere to actually start to come down again. Now, one of the other things I just wanted to talk about, so within this slide here, you can see these are sort of the subcategories. There's 4 main categories of gases, although there are 7, there's 4 main categories: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and then fluorinated gases. These are man-made gases that we've produced, we put to the atmosphere. So I think most of us have hopefully heard of CFCs. They were the ozone depleting substances, which got banned through the Montreal Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol actually started to look at the rest of these gases that don't have the same ozone depleting effect, but do lead to actual climate change and warming of the planet. Now, one of the key things on here is, and lesser known as a greenhouse gas, is water vapor. Now, water vapor has been listed as a significant amplifier to the warming effect. It makes up 90% of all the gases in the atmosphere and is responsible for about half of the Earth's greenhouse effect. So it's really important to understand that as a planet, we need to have a greenhouse effect in order to stay warm. If we didn't have that, the planet would freeze and we wouldn't be able to live here anyway. So it is necessary for the planet to have some form of layer and barrier to help with the greenhouse in order for us to stay, the way the planet that we are. The issue, however, is that the level of water vapor increases as the planet warms, because warm air is able to hold more water. So what we have is, as we are warming the planet with the greenhouse gases, we're allowing the planet to actually store more water vapor. That in turn is actually feeding into the planet becoming warmer. So it's what we call a positive feedback loop. So we initially increase the temperature through greenhouse gases, that increases the water vapor, that increases the temperature more. The more we increase those greenhouse gases, the more we increase that water vapor, and the significantly higher our planet becomes. So it's really important that we do consider actually the full loop of how all of these gases combine, how they all work together, and why it's important that we focus. Now, whilst water vapor has the biggest impact, the other greenhouse gases are non-condensable. So what we mean is they don't change their state in lower temperatures. They stay as a gas even in the upper atmosphere. So it doesn't matter what we do to atmospheric temperature, the concentration of greenhouse gases remains the same. Water vapor, however, is condensable, and as such will change depending on atmospheric temperatures. So as the planet warms, the level of water vapor in the atmosphere increases, exacerbating the condition. But as it only remains in the atmosphere for around 9 years, it can therefore reduce. So if we reduce the amount of greenhouse gases and cool the planet, the opposite will be true. There'll be less water vapor, which will then help to actually decrease the temperature of the planet as well. So this process of water vapor and how it condenses in the atmosphere is one of the reasons why climate change impacts the weather. So in places that are drier and therefore actually warmer, they will become more warm, meaning that the atmosphere will hold more water vapor, leading to less rain. So in places where rain is more prevalent, the change in temperature speeds up the water cycles, leading to an increased rainfall and chance of flooding, particularly after a longer dry period. So what we find is actually, whilst we're warming the planet, rather than actually changing how much rain we get, we just exacerbate. So areas that are already dry will become drier, and areas that are already wet will become wetter. So these floods, the heavy rain and downpour will become a more frequent event. And it's all basically how water vapor interacts with the atmosphere through the changes we're making with the greenhouse gases. So while water vapor contributes most in terms of the warming impact, it is directly driven by carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, to the point that even a small change in levels will have a larger impact overall, as these are a direct influence of water vapor. This is why actually when we look at the concentration of gases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases only make up 0.04% of the total amount of atmosphere that we have. But that 0.04% has such a big role to play in terms of how it impacts it. And any change to that percentage has an impact on the amount of water vapor, which is what's actually leading and spiraling the climate change out of control. So in terms of the gases then, just to go through them. So Essentially, carbon dioxide, I think, is the one we all know about. It's the one that gets spoken about the most, mostly because it's the most abundant of all the greenhouse gases. This is produced by burning fuels, particularly through road transport, cutting down trees, or even changing use of land. So through agriculture and tilling the land releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. The next is methane. Now, when we talk about, as I said before, about when we look at the gases, we refer these to carbon equivalences. So what we can see here is what the gas is, what its average lifespan in the atmosphere is, but when we compare that to a 100-year period, this is the impact it has. So as a warming potential, methane is about 25 to 35 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So for every one molecule of methane, it has a warming effect of 25 times one molecule of carbon dioxide. Now, methane is produced by cows, agriculture, rotting vegetation, and is also the main constituent of natural gas. However, when you burn natural gas, you produce more carbon dioxide and only a small amount of methane. Most of the methane is produced from landfills, or it's produced from agriculture, animals, cows particularly, in terms of that as well, and any sort of rotting vegetation. So nitrous oxide, also known as laughing gas, is used as an anesthetic, although we are working within the healthcare industry to try and minimize that and actually remove nitrous oxide from the used gases. This is also produced by burning fossil fuels and wood, and also is a main contributor believed to be through farming, through pesticides and adding nitrogen through the soil. So the more that we try to, farm larger areas and put more pesticides into the soil, the more we're actually creating nitrogen and putting that into the atmosphere as well. This is around 200 to 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And then finally, when we look at the fluorinated gases, now most of these that we would be aware of would be the refrigerants in our refrigerators, in our air conditioning systems. So the chlorofluorocarbons, as they essentially are called, perfluorocarbons, these sort of things. These are essentially refrigerants that we use within our air conditionings, within our refrigeration systems, and with any sort of cooling system that we use. We also find them in things like fire extinguishers, solvents, cleaners, coolants, etc. Now, the impact that these have are several thousand times more of that of carbon dioxide. So for every kilogram we put into it, they have a significant effect on the warming that we have within the atmosphere. Now, these are all man-made gases, and that's why it's really important that, particularly when we start to look at industry, what we do within our buildings, what we do within who we work with, is understanding how much of these they're using. Because yes, okay, switching to air conditioning can be a more efficient heating or cooling system, but the refrigerant in that, when that leaks, that has a significant impact to the actual warming that we put in the planet as well. So it's just important to understand that this is what we mean when we talk about carbon. These are the sort of gases that are included in it. And because they have different impacts and different lifespans, we refer to it as a carbon equivalence, or just the term carbon, to summarize basically the impact that all of these have over that 100-year period that we know carbon remains in the atmosphere for. So why is this important? Essentially, current climate models predict that if we make no changes at all, we're on track to around about a 3-degree rise. Now, to date, the temperature has risen to around 1.2 degrees since pre-industrial levels. In 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement, so this is part of COP, I forget which COP it is, but the Conference of Parties, they came together, and it's the first time ever that majority of the parties at the Paris Climate Agreement put in law and signed the Paris Climate Agreement, which sets in law that countries need to work towards limiting the increase in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees. Now, bear in mind, we're at 1.2 degrees already, so that actually limits the additional increase to less than a degree. So that's what essentially we're playing with. Now, what they really wanted to do was to reduce the global warming, the temperature rise up to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, because we have a 100-year period, what they actually want to do is they want to peak it and then bring it back down again. Now, as a result of this, the UK government has set in place the legally binding target of net zero by 2050. So this is probably what we've heard about within the news, or one of the topics that gets talked about most of all, like what is net zero? So we'll cover that a bit later on. But it was the Paris Climate Agreement that first put in law that as countries, we have to work towards limiting the temperature increase. And as a result of that, the UK government has now set a net zero target by 2050. And it's that net zero target that is driving most of industry at the moment. So local authorities, healthcare sectors, even any sort of public bodies, schools, education, etc., are now sort of putting their heads together as to how do we achieve net zero? What does net zero mean to us? And what is it that we need to do to achieve it, in the longer term? So realistically, in order for us to actually achieve this, we all need to start making better choices that have a positive impact on reducing carbon emissions and working towards a better future. Now, within the infographic that we have here, this is the reason why they want to try get to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees, because we can see here the impact that just that half a degree has in terms of the damage it can cause by actually getting to 2 degrees and then trying to bring it back down. Because the problem is, once we hit 2 degrees and all that damage occurs, we'll never be able to reverse that. We'll be able to bring the carbon down and actually make the planet cooler, but we won't be able to stop the damage that would be caused by it. So if we can limit that to 1.5, we have a far better chance, far less will go wrong essentially in terms of the planet and how we'll interact, so that when we do bring that down again, we'll have a much better planet to move forward from. So just continuing on that, so essentially, climate change is identified as the mega trend. So, we hear it spoken about all the time. You now see on advertising, all the organizations are talking about it. They're all looking at what their sustainability actions and activities need to be. So as individuals, we need to start doing the same. We need to start talking about this. We need to really understand that what we're doing does have an impact, and we can make really simple choices that will help to actually benefit and improve the planet going forward. So the biggest challenge, however, that we face is how quickly can we do this? So we are certain, and what we mean by that is 99% of all scientists have stated that human activities are causing this change. And in order to ensure we minimize the impact as much as possible, we all need to act as soon as possible. So while we know that the climate changes naturally, these changes actually occur over hundreds of years. And what we've actually seen within the climate science itself is that the increase in carbon is directly linked to the increase in temperature. But the scary part is how fast that's happening. So yes, we are aware that over time, the planet will warm and cool, and it's done this cycle for hundreds and thousands of years, but it's happened over so long, slow periods that what we're actually seeing, and we can see within this graph here, is how fast it's rising, that this cannot be explained through any normal or natural effect, which is why we're now certain that it's our impact that's having the rise in temperatures. So as I said earlier about the show your stripes, this is essentially a breakdown of the heat. So they essentially associated the color to the global temperatures going back from when records started up to recent. And what's fantastic within this is that you can really clearly and easily see how much warmer the planet is coming. And actually, in the last decade, we've had 10 of the hottest years within the last decade, which again is staggering when you look at it. And from a teaching perspective, you show this to a child, it's really easy for them to understand, and they can really see actually the impact that's being had in the last sort of period. And that's why it's really important that we start to make changes and start to do what we need to do as soon as possible. So in terms of the planet and its natural effect and everything we're talking about it. So this is essentially the carbon cycle. So just continuing with the science as it is, this is basically how the planet has looked after itself for hundreds of thousands of years. So whilst majority of scientists believe that we are directly responsible for the impact we're having on our planet, there are still those who dispute it. So what they tend to say is that, well, the planet goes through this natural cycle and warms and cools as it does anyway. So yes, that's correct. The planet has and always will take part in its own carbon cycle. And without man's interference, the planet has continually emitted and sequestered carbon through a variety of natural sequences. Now, the oceans played one of the largest roles in terms of carbon, as part of the carbon cycle. And it captures more carbon than any other carbon source, but it is really slow moving and relies heavily on organic life in the ocean, such as phytoplankton, which actually absorb a lot of the carbon that gets eaten by other animals, and actually they become natural carbon sinks themselves. So the change between the ocean surface and the deep ocean, so when we say sequestration, we mean actually how much carbon it absorbs and pulls into the ocean. This changes over hundreds of years. So carbon is better captured in colder waters. So in cold water, it absorbs carbon really easier, and it's then easier to actually sink that carbon down to the ocean floor, into the deep ocean. That essentially over hundreds of years mixes with the rest of the ocean, eventually hits the warmer streams, warms, and is then released back into the atmosphere again. So we are still studying this, and we're still improving our understanding of it. But the latest science suggests that the ocean captures around 25% of all carbon across the globe, which is far bigger than anything else, any single other organism. What actually we find is that it tends to capture more carbon when the planet is warm. So what we've actually found is that through climate change, although we've been making the planet warmer, the ocean has been capturing more of that carbon, which is why the actual lag in terms of where we should be to where we are now has been slower, because the ocean is playing a pivotal role in trying to keep the carbon amount in the atmosphere down. The change in how the ocean works is one of the responsible mechanisms for the historic climate change. The reason why our temperatures have gone from higher to lower throughout time is because as the planet's cooled, the ocean releases carbon. When the planet warms up, the ocean captures carbon. And that's caused the sort of drift that we've seen over time. The problem we have at the moment is as the ocean captures more carbon, which is what it's doing at the moment, it starts to shift the chemical makeup of the sea. So what we're actually doing is we're introducing more carbon, that's creating carbonic acid, and it's shifting the alkalinity of the sea, which then has further problems. Now, what we also have to understand is that our impacts and what we do within our oceans is also exacerbating this condition. So the more that we continue to destroy and interrupt natural cycles, such as the more we overfish, the more we take organic life out of the oceans, the more we damage the sea floor, the more that we damage coral reefs through other activities. All of these things actually disrupt and interfere with the ocean's natural ability to look after itself. So whilst the ocean would generally shift its chemical risk, it will rely on its organic matter to help sort that out. But our intervention and what we're doing within the oceans is actually preventing it from doing that. And this is actually leading to further problems. So under normal circumstances, the planet remains roughly in a state of balance. But as we continue to burn fossil fuels, and this is the point, so within the natural carbon cycle, roughly speaking, the planet balances itself out. But what we're doing is we're burning fossil fuels and adding additional carbon every time. So what we found is the planet is able to essentially accumulate and sequester about 50% of all of the carbon we're putting into the atmosphere on an annual basis. But that still leaves 50% sat in the atmosphere that just isn't doing anything other than sitting within the atmosphere itself. So year on year, we're adding around 50% of the total carbon that goes into the atmosphere. There's still 50% increase on top of year on year that's being added to it. To further complicate that, the more we cut down trees, the more we increase our agriculture to increase sort of animal and livestock. These are actually adding to and further leading to the problems. So this is one of the reasons why in the UK, there's a lot of talk at the moment to try and increase the number of trees we have, particularly on a global level, to try and increase these natural ways of the planet to try pull carbon out of the atmosphere. It's also one of the reasons why agriculture is particularly problematic, because the more we increase by, for example, cutting down the rainforest in order to create agricultural land to essentially feed us our meat, this is having a significant impact on the planet and its ability to naturally monitor and manage how much carbon is in the atmosphere, and this is leading to the warming that we see. So as we can see here on the chart on the right-hand side, these are the atmospheric carbon dioxide measurements as taken in Mauna Loa from as early as 1958 through to current date, and you can steadily see that rise. And actually, although I haven't got this image, but you can find it. So if we look at the rise that we can see here on the right-hand side, if you actually plot that directly to this graph, they sit perfectly. And this is why we say it's now almost to the point where we just can no longer dispute it. We can clearly see that the increase in temperature rise is directly linked to the increase in carbon dioxide. So what is a carbon footprint? So essentially, basically put, any activity that we do, and as a result of that action, greenhouse gases are emitted into the atmosphere, that forms part of our carbon footprint. So it's essentially a measure of our impact on how much carbon we release into the atmosphere. So activities are either directly linked to me, and when we say directly, what we mean is that you own or control the emitter source. So for example, the boiler in your house, you control that boiler directly. The fuel that's burnt into it, the emissions that are released from that fuel, you are directly responsible for. The cars that we drive in, we own and control those cars directly. So every time we get in our vehicle and we drive, we are directly responsible for the carbon that's being released as a result of that activity. However, we also have what's called indirect carbon associated to us. So what we mean by this is that where we do not own or control the source of the emissions, but because of our activity, those emissions have been released. So as an example, the food we buy. So different foods have different energy and requirements in terms of how they're grown. Purchasing, the way we purchase food or the type of food that we purchase, we indirectly cause carbon to be released into the atmosphere. We can also think about, when we buy something online, the vehicle that's then sent, we don't own the delivery vehicle, but the result of our online purchase, we've sent that vehicle to a house. So that's indirectly led to carbon being released into the atmosphere. So when we start to think about us and our activities, we have to look at it in two ways: our direct responsibility and our indirect responsibility. And ultimately, we have to take ownership of both. So when we measure our carbon footprint, that's what we basically mean. What is our measurement? What is our impact? And how are we, through our activities, contributing towards climate change? Now, carbon footprint is essentially measured as a weight, and it's measured in what we call tons. And as I said before, when we're talking about carbon, it's the representation of the 7 gases. We refer to it as a carbon equivalent, so CO2e, and that's what the E stands for. It represents that it's not just carbon dioxide, there's also any methane, nitrogen, or other gases that are associated with the greenhouse warming that we are measuring as part of our footprint. So just as an example, and I'll use food as a nice sort of easy one for this. So what's important to note is that there are a wide number of data sets that look at the impact of different food sources and the carbon that goes into it. So one of the benefits that we have for net zero is that net zero requires companies to become far more responsible and transparent about the carbon emissions they release through their activities. Now, the benefit that has to us as consumers is that if that information does become available to us, we can start to make informed decisions. So if we understand how much carbon is associated to different foods, different products, different materials, we can then choose the materials and products that actually have less of an impact on climate change. So as we can see this is an organization, what they've done essentially is they've looked at the entire, what we call life cycle of different types of products, the carbon that went into the production of them, and actually what that looks like across its entire lifespan, from the minute it's grown through to the minute it's packaged and served to us in the supermarkets. And as you can see on here, beef, particularly within the beef herd, lamb and mutton, cheese, sort of meats and dairy have an extremely high impact in terms of its footprint, in terms of its carbon footprint. So when we talk about things like, cutting down our meat meals, yes, we're not talking about cutting them out completely, but just one day change. If all of us actually just cut down on the volume of meat that we eat, that actually directly influences the market, and that actually helps to actually bring down the amount of agriculture, which again helps to lead to reduced sort of climate effects. So the link that's on this side, so this is a food calculator. It's on the BBC website essentially, and what it allows you to do is it allows you to put in, if there's a particular type of food that you eat, quite a lot of, you could put in what the food is, you could put how much of it you eat, and it will actually give you a footprint against that. So you can start to play with different foods and say, well, actually, maybe I want to look at it, maybe I want to replace one for another. And you can see actually how much carbon you can reduce by changing different food choices. But this is the idea of all of it, is that by understanding the impacts we have through these different calculators and through these online sources, and actually from the companies directly, we can start to make more sustainable choices. So, cutting down on red meat as an impact, but you could also think like choosing grass-fed cows, because they have a far less carbon footprint versus grain-fed cows. So free-range grass-grazing cows actually have a smaller footprint versus the sort of farmed cows. So even actually understanding how the sort of food sources are raised and grown and what carbon impacts that have, we don't necessarily need to remove it completely, but we can start to make better choices in what we purchase, how we purchase, and what kind of foods we eat going forwards. So on that basis, then, there are a wide variety of personal carbon footprint calculators that you can look at. I'd recommend everybody to have a go. So they do look at different aspects, they do look at different estimates, and so they will come up with a slightly different footprint each time. The most important thing is that it just gives you an idea of, roughly speaking, what kind of footprint you have. And at this point, that's good enough to understand actually how much of an impact do I have just based on what my house is like, what my driving habits are like, what kind of food am I eating, and actually what does that mean overall to the wider impact that I'm having within the climate itself. Because by understanding what that is, you can then understand what changes that you need to make as well. So according to the latest science, as a country in the UK, we need to reduce the average greenhouse gas emissions to around about 2.5 tons per person. Now, this depends on how you calculate the methodology, but Based on the same methodology, they estimate that the average person's footprint is just over 5 tons. Some calculators may put that as high as 9 tons, but that again varies depending on your lifestyle. However, what's really important is that we have to all get to a personal carbon footprint of about 2.5 tons in order to hit that 1.5 degrees. So as I said, it is something that we do need to become more aware of. We need to start having the conversations. We need to start to understand what our footprints are, and then actually start to understand what it is that we can do to minimize and impact that. So what's important is that actually, as you start to make these small actions, as you start to make these different choices in terms of your purchases, with time, bear in mind industry and business are having to change as a result of net zero and the targets that are being laid upon them. But as they actually change their activities and how they do things, it will also help to benefit yourself, because you'll be able to make better decisions, and the decisions you make will have a better impact on your footprint as well. So it does come full circle. And actually, as an individual, you can put pressures on those companies to really start to, make the information more transparent, to really help you understand what it is that you're purchasing and what impacts they have as well. So, above all, this is led by you as individuals. All of us individually, if we come together and work towards this, we can all make big change across the UK, which is absolutely vital. And this is what we want to try to get to children, to help them to start understanding that, these are things that they're going to need to be thinking about, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to be left with the problems in the long run. So what is it that you can do? I love this cartoon. I just think this is great. One of the things I always sort of come across is sort of like climate denial and the whole, that it's not happening. But I always look at it that, okay, let's just assume that the whole climate change thing is a hoax. All of the activities that we're doing are just making it better. So, one of the most important things is that when we actually look at carbon, when we look at it, is that we just talk about it. We talk about the problem. We start to think about working together and what we need to do to make the necessary improvements. Starting simple is best. Starting really simple with kids, starting really simple with yourself is the best way to do it. Just make a couple of changes in a weekly basis, and then over time develop and make bigger changes, etc. But really starting the conversation is the best place that we can come from. The changes don't have to cost anything. Simple, small things that are completely cost-free can have big changes and big impacts over the longer run. And I always say, regardless of the reasons why, the changes that have been put forward all make the planet a better place. So whether you agree with the science or not, the outcomes can only ever have a positive impact as we move towards renewable, cleaner energy, cleaner transportation, so less fumes at the back of exhausts, healthier lifestyles as we make healthy decisions in terms of the food that we eat, less waste as we try to minimize and try to move away from the single purchase lifestyle, move back to a repairable, reusable world that we lived in many years ago. Start to think about more biodiversity. What kind of plants can we grow? Increasing the number of tree cover, cutting down less trees. Also thinking about, from sustainability perspective, less poverty and better education. So whilst all of this is stemmed around carbon from the outset, actually understanding that from the beginning and then starting to think about the bigger sustainability picture, these all have better consequences and actually lead to a better planet. So regardless of whether you believe in the climate science or not, ultimately the decisions that need to be made are only going to make the planet better across the globe and not just here in the UK as well. So what can we do in terms of activities? So one of the things I always say, so this is a list of 10 actions that you can do, and actually they fit both within your individual life, but also within schools as well. So these are things that you can actually do in school and actually get the kids to do and think about as well. So from our perspective, when we look at an individual level, carbon emissions are directly linked to cost, because we have to burn something, we have to use or consume something in order to release carbon. So actually by reducing the amount of carbon, we're actually reducing the amount that we're either burning or using. So that actually has a direct link in terms of cost. So we all know about, cost of living at the moment and the energy crisis that we're going through. So things like switching off your lights at home when they're not in use. And one really important thing is equipment at the plug. Everything that's plugged in, even if it's on standby, is consuming energy, continuously consuming energy. A simple action of just turning it off at the plug helps to actually reduce that energy. That has both a financial benefit, but also a carbon benefit as well. So just some stats that have come off, sort of a advice website. If we switch lights off when leaving the room, which is great for kids, because honestly, if you can help teach my kids to turn lights off when they leave rooms, I'd love that, rather than me burning them all the time. But just switching lights off when you leave the room in your house can save, roughly speaking, around about £25, depending on how bad you are. And that works out to about 20 kilograms of carbon. So when we leave equipment switched on a plug, looking at all the appliances that we use at home, the energy wasted, if we were to do that and switch off everything at the plug that can be switched off, obviously there have to be some things that are left on, that could roughly save us about 65 pounds or about 53 kilograms of carbon. Now, that stuff you can do both at home and at school as well. Turning down your thermostat. So what we generally tend to look at is when we're looking at a sort of a comfortable level, round about 21 degrees. Now that may depend on how efficient the building is or how efficient the room is. You may sometimes need to go up to about 22, maybe 23, depending on the work that you're doing. But 21 is kind of that golden magic number where actually it's warm, and regardless of the year, it's a good temperature to be. So if you have air conditioned rooms, you never want to go below 21 degrees. 22, 23 degrees is fine, even on the hottest days. That's actually quite cool. But things like actually just turning down your thermostat, keeping it to around about 21 degrees. For every degree that you reduce it by, that's 4% of your energy. So if you go from 22 to 21 degrees, that can save about 40 pounds a year on your heating and about 110 kilograms of carbon in the atmosphere. Draft proofing, so helping to minimize drafts, to improve thermal comfort, certainly to prevent heat from leaking out of your house or even in the schools. So if you have older schools or older buildings, making sure that the seals are up to date, checking the seals regularly. Any seals are either broken or cracked or removed. I've seen some crazy things that kids do to certain building fabric, but just ensuring that the windows are draft proof, making sure that there's no drafts through the doors, that kind of stuff. So in a home domestic setting, that can save up to about 125 pounds a year or about 363 kilograms of carbon. So if we look at just these top three to four things within this list, on a personal level, if you were to do all of these at home, again, depending on where you're starting from, that actually can save you about 255 pounds a year. That equates to about half a ton of carbon. Now, one of the things we always get confused with is that what does half a ton of carbon even mean? So if I were to put that into a context, half a ton of carbon is the same as driving about 1,600 miles, 1,600 miles. Basically, that's the same as driving from Edinburgh to Rome in a diesel vehicle. That's the amount of carbon that you can save by doing those four things. So while I appreciate that it is sometimes hard to think about what a ton of carbon actually means, the simplest method is to compare that against an activity. So driving is probably one of the easiest ones because we can kind of visualize that. So I always say that the simple rule of thumb is that for every 10 miles of driving that you avoid, you save about 3 kilograms of carbon. Vice versa, every 3 kilograms of carbon you save, that's about 10 miles in your vehicle that you can use to sort of demonstrate what half a ton or a ton actually looks like. One thing that I do just want to point in here is, when we look at the last two, so from a school perspective, so washing clothes, that's stuff that you can do at home, and essentially would be that. So just making sure we're keeping temperatures down, that we always make sure our machine is at a full level. So don't do half loads, try and make sure the washing machine is as full as it needs to be or should be to still get a clean wash. But thinking about how your kids get to school, how do you get around? Do you walk? Do you cycle? Do you use public transport? Are students doing that? So, one of the biggest things in terms of actually when we look at carbon, particularly around schools, is that idling cars outside of schools, and not necessarily the carbon impact that has, but the health impact that has to kids as well. So we're seeing much more schools now actually limit cars from actually coming to the front of the gate. So encouraging your students to think about walking or cycling into school is a far better way. It helps to, one, save in terms of carbon, but also helps with their health and well-being as well. Within our school meals, and also we can do at home as well, is perhaps considering switching out one meal, which, if we have mostly meat, switching out one of those meals for a veggie meal. Working with your catering companies to think about cutting your food waste, but from a home perspective, the same thing as well. So thinking about how do you plan your meals? How do you plan portion sizes? And actually, how is it that you can work to minimize your food waste? So one of the ideas I heard the other day was by putting in a use me now section within your fridge. So regardless of everything, you have to go to the use me now section first and eat from that point to minimize the amount of food waste that you have. But the idea is individuals as well, and the last 2 points kind of comes into this. So we all have the power to influence through our purchases or through our activities. So by choosing to only purchase what is needed, so minimizing single-use throwaway type things, we can essentially, which will have a positive and less negative impact. You can start to shape how products are manufactured, grown, or even transported. Your voting powers can also influence policy. So really thinking about what are the campaigns that are serious to you? What is it that you want from your politicians? What is it you want in terms of the direction of the country going forward, not just for ourselves, but for our children as well. So One thing I always say is that, when we talk about this and we look at what's potentially happening, it can sometimes sound all doom and gloom. And what we want to avoid doing is that, yes, it's important to understand the science. It's important to understand the reasons why it's necessary for us to do so. But it's really also important to understand that we have the power to make these changes. Whilst we might think of ourselves as individuals, together we actually have the ability to make significant changes. And that's why it's important and really vital that we educate children to actually understand the task at hand and for them to think about shaping the world in the way in which they want it. Because if we don't start to make these changes now, they're the ones who are left picking up the pieces. So for them to understand it, to talk to them about it, to help them understand the concepts. Because climate anxiety is a real thing. So by speaking to them, to help them understand, to help them realize it's not doom and gloom, we can start to make these changes. We can make the world a better place. If we work together and think about what it is that we need to do going forwards, we can really start to make the changes that are necessary and actually create the world that we want to live in. So that's the sciencey side, and obviously the activities and actions done from it. I just wanted to go through some sort of carbon terms in terms of what they mean. So if you ever hear these things spoken about, or what it is, if it ever comes up in conversation, you understand more or less what we're talking about. So obviously the elephant in the room, net zero, as it's spoken about. So we talked about carbon emissions, and we talked about actually releasing carbon emissions, and we talked about direct and indirect emissions. So when we say net zero, what we're essentially saying is, and what we mean by value chain, is the entire impact we have as an individual or as an organization. Bear in mind, net zero is probably aimed at a sort of organization level, is to understand the full carbon footprint, both in what we directly control, but what we also indirectly influence. So that purchasing power that we have, or actually what are we delivering as a product or a service. We then have to reduce those carbon emissions in line with what climate science says will help us to achieve the well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degree pathway. So that's the first point, is it's about reduction of emissions. Whatever we can't reduce because either technology doesn't allow us to, we have to essentially invest in removals. So removals will be anything that essentially takes carbon out of the atmosphere. We'll come to that a bit later on, but that's basically what we mean by net zero, is there's a balance between what we're actually putting into the atmosphere, we're actually taking back out the atmosphere as well, so that we actually have a net zero gain in terms of carbon emissions. Now, that is slightly different to when we refer to as carbon neutral. So carbon neutrals, the same in terms of, obviously we want to reduce emissions in line with what the climate science says will help us to achieve the pathways, but carbon neutral is focused on only our direct emissions. It doesn't include the influencing area, doesn't include our indirect emissions, just what we, as I say, an organization or a school, our direct emissions. If we reduce those as much as possible, and then we invest in offsetting, which again, I'll come into a bit more detail, we can then claim to be carbon neutral. Carbon negative, which unfortunately can very confusingly be referred to as carbon positive, simply because the word negative feels negative, whereas positive feels positive. I don't know. Basically, from a marketing perspective, people wanted to say, well, we're carbon positive, but what they actually meant was that they're carbon negative. So what we essentially mean by that is that we're actually removing more carbon out of the atmosphere than we're emitting. So if we think about net zero, if say we're putting 10 tons in the atmosphere, we're taking 10 tons out of the atmosphere, we're then net zero. But if we put 10 tons in and we take 20 tons out, we can now claim to be carbon negative. So that's basically what the term means when we refer to that. Absolute zero. So in order for an individual or an organization to be absolute zero, what we're essentially talking about is that we are not emitting any carbon into the atmosphere at all. So there is no need for us to offset or remove. Our operations are completely carbon neutral. There is no carbon associated with that. So then we talk about offsetting and removals. So essentially, offsetting is where we reduce carbon emissions based on a scenario where we make improvements such that additional emissions are avoided. So what we're basically talking about is we invest in projects that help to improve efficiencies, release less carbon into the atmosphere so that we avoid additional carbon being created. I'm probably making this sound far more technical than it is. So just as an example, in Africa, particularly third world countries, that sort of thing, they have a lot of what we call open stoves. So community sort of cooking areas where they just have big fires and essentially they use that for cooking or various activities. So one of the projects that some companies will essentially do is they go out there, they remove the fires, they replace them with more efficient, far more energy efficient cooking systems that allows these communities to still cook their food, but without actually releasing the same amount of carbon into the atmosphere. So that carbon saving that's made through that project, what they eventually do is they turn that saving, for every ton saved, they turn that into a credit, shall we say. So as an organization, I can buy credits to the value of the carbon. So I said before, for releasing 10 tons of carbon, I would buy 10 credits from that organization to say I've offset my 10 tons by investing in this project, which has reduced 10 tons through its activity. So I'm not actually reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. I'm just investing in avoiding additional carbon being created. So this is why it gets really technical and complicated, but that's basically what they mean by offsetting. And that's where it's different to removals, because removal is that I'm not avoiding it. I'm actually sucking it out of the atmosphere. I'm taking it away. I'm not preventing something else. I'm not shifting my problem elsewhere. I'm actually helping solve the problem by taking my carbon out. So when we talk about removals, this is where we are permanently capturing or sequestering carbon, which can be done through biomatter, plants, peatlands, any sort of thing like that. So any sort of thing that sucks carbon out of the atmosphere. Or what we are particularly working on in the UK at the moment and globally is through mechanical carbon capture and storage. So at the moment, this is in, let's say it exists, the technology exists, it's just not scalable yet. It isn't available across industry just yet. Hopefully that will happen in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. But essentially what we're looking to do is to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere through mechanical processes and store that underground or turn it into alternatives. And then finally, just in case you hear the phrase, we talk about science-based targets. So this is essentially where, as I said before, we're literally targeting our performance against what is required for us in order to achieve the well below 2 degrees. So these are Paris Climate Agreement targets, essentially, to ensure that the carbon reductions we make help move the country towards a well below 2 degree sort of target. So this is an actual thing that you can commit to. So you essentially put forward your targets, it will go through to Science Based Targets Initiative, and they will actually verify if those targets are actually in line with the climate science, and therefore you can claim that you have science-based targets. Now, as a consumer, it's important to know that actually, if you're looking at choosing companies or who to actually purchase off, if they are throwing these terms around, this is what we're expecting that they're doing. So this is where you can start to challenge them and say, well, actually, what are you doing? What is your climate science target? What is your net zero agenda? How are you actually achieving that? So it helps us as individuals, but certainly if you ever need to talk about it, this is basically what we mean.